With that, I come to the next speaker, straight out of the Arabian shores, Ms. Roula Hamati, who is the coordinator for the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, based out of Lebanon, but Roula is currently living in Doha. And I know this is a conversation that Roula and I've had on many occasions in many different spaces. I think the big perspective here, Roula, would be to understand how you feel these conversations that you hear translates to a Middle Eastern vibe, translates to a conversation from the Arab states. Thanks, Roula, over to you.
Thanks, Shabri. Yeah, I think, when we were kind of thinking about this webinar and preparing for this webinar, the question was, how do these kind of global frameworks translate at the regional and national level, and they translate into realities? So I guess to kind of answer the question, I just want to start by saying, and I think William kind of said it, it's not smooth. So there are a lot of obstacles when we talk about translating global frameworks into realities on the ground. And to start within the particular context of the Arab region, I think it's important to realize that in the region, at least in the Arab region, that the relationship between these kinds of frameworks and governments taking it on has been a bit complicated. So for instance, if you want to look at the two biggest questions in terms of mobility and movement in the region, which is basically migration and refugee flows, and then we look at the legal frameworks for these kinds of movements, we realize that most of these frameworks are not either adopted or ratified by the governments in question. So let's say the Convention on Migrant Workers is the part of the Arab countries that have adopted this convention, for instance, are countries that don't necessarily receive migrant workers. So mostly the North African countries that have migration flows towards Europe. By contrast, if we look at the Refugee Convention, we also realize that a lot of the countries that have not, that receive refugees have not ratified the Refugee Convention. So there is a little bit of this kind of dynamic and relationship in the region. The Global Compact on Migration, which is a kind of a different framework, has been an interesting exercise, I would say, for the region, in the sense of, at the beginning, and at least in the negotiation phase, there was a kind of an involvement by countries in the region in the negotiation of the framework. But now when we go to the implementation of the Global Compact, we see that this initial enthusiasm or initial kind of involvement is also kind of withering down, and I guess we'll get to that in a little bit. The other issue, or the other obstacle that I guess is also there is really in relation to a direct contradiction between how migration is and how migration is governed in practice versus how these frameworks, say migration should be governed. And I give two examples here. The first example, for instance, if you look at how migration is in the Gulf region, for example, we can see that a lot of it is the circular labor migration process, or temporary labor migrants. If we look, for instance, at the Global Compact Objective 16 about the full inclusion, obviously there is kind of a contradiction there. And I think these are kind of tensions that exist throughout in terms of how migration is really, and how kind of these frameworks, try to govern migration. So there is this conflict. Another conflict, and obviously you remember, Shabri, is, if you remember in the negotiations of the Global Compact, for example, the Arab group was very strongly vocal against any kind of, talk about the right to asylum, talk about international protection, talk about mixed movement, talk about non-refoulement, and all these kinds of bigger questions. There was strong pushback precisely because, there are kind of these tensions in the region. My third point, and that's obviously an obstacle that many people have talked about, is really that, adopting frameworks at the global level, ratifying conventions, adopting the compact and all of that does not necessarily translate into action at the national level. And this is, this is because of a lot of things. Obviously, some of them also include kind of the legal framework in the country. Others include the whole notion of the rule of law. institutional capacities and all of that. So I guess this is something also to look at when we talk about how do these frameworks translate into kind of actions on the ground. And the fourth, I guess, and in connection to the third, point is really that, there is a kind of a problem that is becoming apparent within the nature of these frameworks, whether, whether they are compacts, whether they are kind of treaties and all of that. I mean, an obvious kind of critique to the compact that everybody was kind of talking about a lot in the beginning was that it was not a non-binding instrument, obviously. And this is true for non-binding instruments, but also it is even true for binding instruments, because on the ground and in reality, although there are different recourses that can, someone can take in case of violations, but the consequences are not there because it's such a lengthy, complicated bureaucratic process that often it is, it's like there are no kinds of consequences for, non-implementation. And finally, I think that brings us to the whole question of, the question of incentives. So if countries are only going to implement, if they kind of consent to implement, then what is kind of the bigger value of having frameworks like this? And I think this is something we will need to reflect on. And I realize that, more or less I've given kind of gloomy or dim picture, but I'm not saying that there is no kind of value to having frameworks or coming together around these kinds of processes. And I think one value, and in particular to this region, is obviously of setting the norm, setting the standard. So what is the standard against which we measure ourselves, we compare ourselves, and what should we be looking at and aspiring to do? And I think this is important and interesting, and you can see that a lot of countries also try to, belong to this global community that kind of looks at the governance of migration in a certain way. And that has been an incentive in certain cases, obviously, and not in all cases, for countries to do reforms. But I think, we've heard a lot about projects and, initiatives and small initiatives. And also maybe William spoke about low-hanging fruits. And I think this is kind of where we are in kind of the bigger picture of things. This is where the focus is, and how can we kind of shift from this small, focus on small initiatives, small projects, to the wider, bigger transformative agenda? I think this is the question. If we look at the Arab region again, I think we will see that this has been one of the regions that have moved a lot in terms of policy making and policy processes. And this is something, this is something good. This is something to look at and to think about how can we do more of it. And in particular within this region, I think the region that has moved more than the rest is actually the GCC, where a lot of policy developments have been happening over the past few years. And obviously this is not a kind of a full picture policy movement. Obviously this policy have been focused on some of the aspects relevant, for instance, labor governance, trafficking. A lot of policies have touched on that, or even irregular migration. But the question then becomes of how do we have a more kind of comprehensive process? And I think just to kind of conclude, I think that there is a trend now, as Nicola talked to kind of move towards this, soft law approach and less binding approach of doing things. And this has, obviously, as Nicola has said, come at the expense of rights. And I think we recognize this as a weakness generally of the process. And I think we need to find ways to kind of go beyond this, low-hanging fruit approach. The other thing, kind of my final point on this, I think is, we've heard a lot about how COVID has impacted migration. And I think it's also interesting to note that one of the ways is, has been really kind of the resurgence of member states as really the primary actors. I don't think we've heard anybody kind of come and say, well, according to GCM objectives so and so, we need to do this and that. And I think this is something to reflect on, because when emergency strikes, I think we are seeing kind of a return back to the nation model of doing things. So.
Great, thanks so much. Roula, I wouldn't really call the picture gloomy, because you underlined it with a very important perspective, and that is the fact that we have perhaps seen such a big rise in policy developments in the Middle East, in the Arab states, which is so important for us to recognize. And for me, therefore, the picture is not yet gloomy. I obviously try to always look at the light at the end of the tunnel, or the cloud with the silver lining, and not forget that there is always something that we can lead to on a much more positive perspective. You know, you mentioned about Roula, about the less binding approach of some of these perspectives. I mean, I remember very well, you know, whether we're talking about regional processes or global agendas, it's always, what is it? Non-binding, informal, state-led, voluntary, action-oriented. You know, these are the kind of perspectives we put forward. And I remember Bangladesh was perhaps the only government under the leadership of the foreign secretary and the others during the negotiations of the GCM that really spoke about maybe perhaps focusing the GCM to be a binding document. Now, let's just put it this way. Even without it being binding, only 152 out of the 193 member states, majority, of course, adopted it. Now, if it was binding, how different would things have been? So perhaps something for us to also reflect along those lines. Thanks so much, Roula. You know, when we talk about policy developments, then it is also imperative for us to understand that there is another region. Policy developments in the Middle East not only affect Asia, it also affects Africa.